Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I've been MIA for a while yet again, and I had loads of ideas for videos this time, but I basically had a mesotherapy treatment on my eyes. You can probably still see this bruise here, but it was really, really bad. It looked like I'd been socked in both eyes. It was super black and I obviously had a bad reaction to it, and so I didn't want to come on camera and have that video there forever. So I waited till it at least got to this level. But that's where I've been. But I've actually had so many videos that I've really felt inspired and wanted to jump on and make. So I have a whole list of things now. I'm going to try and get through them. So the first one I wanted to make was about anxious and avoidant, which is a topic that I've covered multiple times. I've done a lot of work on myself with anxious avoidant tendencies. And I also observe it a lot now in people around me. And sometimes, I actually feel like I've completely fixed my anxious avoidance. I don't have any of the traits anymore of an anxious avoidant. It did take me about 10 years to do that work, but I really feel like that's something that I really cleared in myself to at least a very good level. But what tends to happen is when you've cleared through your sort of dominant pattern, you tend to then reach the shadow pattern. And I feel that I'm starting to see this in other people as well. I can almost see their dominant, even though they have a dominant pattern, when you look a bit harder, you can see their shadow pattern too. So for example, like we think of the anxious person as somebody that's kind of a little bit codependent and they desperately want to be in relationship with somebody, right? They want to move closer to somebody, they want to close the gap. Meanwhile, we see the avoidant person as somebody that wants to, when they feel engulfed and they feel someone's sort of moving towards them too heavily, they want to put distance on, which triggers anxious person to be like, I've been left, I must fill that gap, I can't let that person like escape. And then this person just gets further and further away because they don't want to be engulfed. And then when this person is like, oh, sod you then, this person is like, oh, it feels safe now. So, the avoidant moves in again, rinse, repeat, cycle repeats until you do the work on yourself and you actually change yourself and become less anxious or less avoidant. And often you can work through that together. There comes a point where you can have good discussion with your partner and you can start to work through that pattern with them. And that sort of, initially it generally just is very, very toxic and it's just push, pull, and, it just ends up where you have to leave. And then as you work through it, you'll tend to find that you can then have these discussions and you can, both parties can take responsibility for their own work. And what I notice as well is when a predominantly more anxious person puts down boundaries, that seems to make the avoidant really grow because they suddenly can't just come back into the revolving door without questions being asked. And it's like, well, no, actually, like you backed off. So do you want to apologize and explain why you backed off? And what are you going to do to change so that you don't back off anymore? Once you start having those discussions and it's not just like, you're so happy to see the person that you just allow them back in, no questions, that is when you're just going to get rinse, repeat. And these discussions are very important, but this is kind of a little bit off topic. I'm just doing a little bit of background on anxious avoidant. So what I'm starting to notice now is that I used to think, I've always known I'm anxious and avoidant, and I just thought I was in that sort of smaller category that had both. But what I'm starting to see now is that everybody has both, actually. Everybody actually probably even in, I don't know if I necessarily believe in this secure attachment stuff, because you often can still see, just because someone's in a relationship doesn't mean they don't have anxious and avoidant tendencies. And in a way I call secure attachment, I'm a bit different to other people. I don't see it as necessarily the ultimate, because I see that as a bit like how Eckhart Tolle describes the happy sort of ego, where you're okay with the status quo, so you don't really need to do the deep inquiry into self. And I think some people have just learned to be in sort of slightly anxious avoidance relationships and make them work, but they're not like totally ultimately fulfilled. Because how many relationships do you see that are just absolutely incredible, bonded soul connections? Generally those people have done the work on themselves and they've done a lot of deep self-inquiry, and they didn't just like fall into those at 19. That's quite rare. So anyway, I believe that everybody has that duality within them, and that you're not just anxious, you're not just avoidant, but you have like an undercurrent shadow side that kind of you don't see because it's a blind spot. So say, for example, you're an anxious person and you're so used to chasing and trying to close the gap. What you really don't see is that you're actually an avoidant, because you're actually chasing unavailable people because you're equally as afraid to actually have a committed, stable union with someone and be vulnerable. You're still afraid. You're chasing because you're actually afraid. And you're not chasing because you want it, like you think you are, but then you wouldn't be chasing people that were pulling away. You'd be giving up on those people, and you'd be allowing in, and you'd be connecting with people that were available. So whilst you might think you're an anxious, you're also an avoidant. And the same for avoidance. Like, they might think they're avoidant, but they actually have an anxious attachment, because the reason they're avoidant is because they're so anxious. If they're in a relationship, they're going to be left, they're going to be abandoned, and it's going to hurt, right? So everybody's just afraid of being hurt. And that's why we have these push-pull, anxious, avoidant relationships. It's people afraid to be hurt, to be rejected, to be abandoned, all these things, whatever triggers it. And people will find any way of avoiding these relationships. And they will find different patterns to cope with that, be it pulling away when things get intense, be it chasing and trying to close the gap, be it transactional relationships. This was something that kind of I witnessed in other people. It's not a pattern of mine. And it really made me dig deeper on that one as well, and see how some people use sort of more transactional relationships or student-teacher relationships to also hold space between, you know, having a connection that doesn't sort of cross that boundary. You know, it's why people go to prostitutes, right? Because they like the idea that it's transactional, it doesn't involve feelings, and they can just stop the payment when they want to. That's why prostitution is a thing, really. It probably wouldn't be a thing if people didn't have anxious and avoidant tendencies, because they would want to build healthy, stable relationships and connections, but they like the idea that something is transactional and it doesn't have to get too close. And so really this video is about, if you're anxious, you are actually avoidant. You are actually avoiding a relationship by chasing unavailable people. And it's not that you want in a relationship and they're running away from you. You are not really wanting that relationship on that deeper level either. Like, you are both holding relationships at a distance. One of you by backing off, and one of you by chasing people that are just not suitable to have a relationship with, or they don't want a relationship with you, or they're not available emotionally to have a relationship. And it's like a charge, and it's become so much more clear to me, actually. The more I leave it behind, the more I can almost, you feel it very momentarily, like, oh, you know, I can feel that unavailable that unavailable trigger, and it's always a very heightened experience, right? And always generally leads to disappointment. And you can see it so much clearer as you step out of the pattern. You can see all those people that maybe you had that charge with in the past, where it was like, oh, and it feels very like intense and extreme and wow, you know, connection, and it tends to burn out, because it's really just your like a wounds being sort of triggered, and they're a safe person. It's like, even though they're not safe because they're avoidant or they're anxious, it's like you feel they're safe momentarily, because they're not gonna, you know, subconsciously, you know, they're not gonna easily fall into a relationship, and that's safe. If you don't want a relationship, subconsciously, if you don't want a relationship, it's safe to connect to somebody that also doesn't want that, right? So you're just the same as each other, and there's always this universal mirror going on, that what you are, you attract. So if you're attracting avoidance, you actually are avoidant too. It's just that you think you're anxious because your behavior is anxious, but it's covering an avoidant shadow. And that's my first video, and yeah, I've got a few more things that I really want to chat about and catch up on, and I hope everyone is good, and I will speak soon. Bye bye.